Dr. Liz LEVIDOW. The campaign against criminalization communities initially to oppose the UK's Terrorism Act 2000, opposing its bans on national liberation movements such as the Kurdistan Workers' Party and the Tamil Tigers, Liberation Tigers of Tamil. Campaign against criminalization communities has also opposed all subsequent anti-terror legislation with its executive powers of punishment without trials. And thank you for your time. You got the time for us to give your thoughts to us, to share with us, to give your support to us. It's the time to Dr. Liz LEVIDOW. Please join with me to listen to his thoughts.
Yes. Over several decades, the Sri Lankan state has carried out institutional racism, war crimes, and eventually genocide against the Tamil people, all with legal impunity. To hold the Sri Lankan state accountable, this week's fast by Ambihai Selvakumar and the wider protest it has mobilized has specific demands on the UK government. For example, to recommend to the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly that Sri Lanka be referred to the International Criminal Court and take steps to investigate charges of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This is just the first of several demands that the UK government should support. But through all these years, the UK government has done nothing towards such aims, towards holding the Sri Lankan state accountable. And we should recognize why, because the UK government has been a partner of Sri Lanka's crimes. An investigation could reveal the UK's complicity. So we should be demanding that the UK itself be held accountable for its complicity. But then who could hold the UK accountable? I return to that at the end of my comments. Let's go back a couple decades when the UK was playing a double game. It was officially supporting the peace process while also undermining it. In 2001, the Sri Lankan government was being pressurized by many governments to engage in peace talks with the LTTE and thus implicitly recognize parity with the LTTE as a legitimate power. But in 2001, the Terrorism Act 2000 was used to ban the LTTE. And then the UK government used its lobbying efforts to get a similar ban by the European Union, which succeeded in 2006. Now, this made many differences within the UK itself, as well as in Sri Lanka. It meant that refugees fleeing Sri Lanka had greater difficulty to claim refugee status. See, previously, before these so-called anti-terror laws, anyone fleeing persecution by a foreign government could claim political status on grounds that they had some connection with a opposition force, even an armed force, resisting that regime. And this was often accepted as evidence that the person was truly a political refugee. But the Terrorism Act 2000 turned this all upside down because the refugee legislation excludes terrorists, whatever that may mean. And it was given this new meaning by the Terrorism Act 2000. So it then became more difficult to claim refugee status on such evidence of one's involvement with a national liberation movement, or even became a liability, because then the person could be prosecuted under the anti-terror laws, as well as having no prospect of obtaining refugee status. So it became necessary to conceal any involvement with the national liberation movement, such as the LTTE. And then even if one has managed to obtain refugee status, it then became more difficult to gain naturalization as a British citizen, because you might fail the good character test. Say if you were convicted of terrorism in the country of your origin, and that could mean almost anything, that you had some vague association with resistance movements, then you were stigmatized and denied citizenship. And that's because the so-called anti-terror laws apply to any activity anywhere in the world. Then these laws have been used as an instrument of foreign policy to stigmatize anyone here simply supporting self-determination somewhere else. Now let's just look briefly at how these laws have been used against Tamils here. For example, when groups advocating Tamil self-determination have tried to book venues for public events, somehow the security forces, MI5, find out and intimidate the venue. They tell the venue, you have a booking for a pro-terrorist organization. And of course, the venue is frightened and cancels the booking. If you merely advocate human rights, then you might succeed in holding that booking. So in effect, these laws were being used to fracture the Tamil community and create a self-censorship about self-determination as the key demand, and to reduce politics to merely human rights, a language which prevents any political understanding of why there is the conflict in the first place. As other examples, the Charity Commission has been legally obliged to implement the anti-terror laws, so they disqualified several prominent Tamils from being trustees of charities on grounds of some supposed association with the LTTE in Sri Lanka. Now, here's another case which many of you will know, that after a couple prominent Tamil activists here took part in the peace talks with Sri Lanka, with apparent support from the UK government, even paid for their travel, then shortly thereafter, MI5 instigated the Crown Prosecution Service to prosecute them under the anti-terror laws on grounds that they had organized a rally in here for Tamil self-determination. The Native Americans in the USA have a word for this. White man speaks with forked tongue. Now let's go back to the origin of this UK complicity, which is even before Sri Lanka became independent. And here I'm drawing on research that was done by my comrade Andy Higginbottom, whose talk you can find on the internet. In 1947, the three military chiefs of the UK, that is all the armed forces, briefed the UK government during the negotiations about independence. They advised, at the time, the Labour government to introduce forces and take action as necessary to defend our interests in Sri Lanka. And that meant to involve the British military secret services and top politicians in training and directing the forces of the Sri Lankan state to eliminate any potential internal threat. And that has meant racial discrimination and war crimes against the Tamil people. So for a half century, the UK military has been training the upper ranks of the Sri Lankan military, especially in what they call counterinsurgency techniques. Of course, the UK have been experts in those techniques from all its colonies over the past century as a way to suppress the civilian population and to label them as terrorists, such as in Kenya, Ireland, and many other places. Now, let's now move to the war, which culminated in the genocide in 2009. A decisive turning point was around February 2009, when United Nations officers were raising the alarm within the organization about the impending massacre that would be carried out by the Sri Lankan military. So what happened? Nothing, because the UK's permanent representative at the United Nations, John Sawyers, managed to stop any Security Council discussion about the crisis in Sri Lanka. So this UK intervention behind the scenes facilitated the massacre. And this was, of course, further facilitated by the whole counter-terror framework, which has been used to stigmatize any demand for self-determination as terrorist, and so sanitize the Sri Lankan terrorist state as a counter-terror force and as an ally against terrorism. Long after the war ended and long after the LTE was effectively destroyed in 2009, it remained on the list of banned terrorist organizations here. Why is that? Well, that continuity simply illustrates that the aim was always to terrorize, stigmatize, and silence any demand for Tamil self-determination rather than protect anyone from violence. Well, who is guilty for all this? Well, certainly the Labour government and then the subsequent Conservative governments. But unfortunately, it goes further because almost all members of parliament voted for the anti-terror laws. They weren't given an opportunity to vote on which organizations would be banned as terrorists under those laws, but they had an opportunity to raise a protest when that terror list was issued in 2001. And as far as I remember, very few members of parliament raised any protest about that list, certainly not about the Tamils. Now there has been the all-party parliamentary group for Tamils, but is it really for Tamils? Most members voted for the Terrorism Act 2000 and said nothing when the LTE was banned. So they are complicit in the UK government's strategy of stigmatizing the LTE and thereby sanitizing the Sri Lankan state as a counter-terror force. So all these MPs should be held accountable for their complicity. Well, how can this be done? Well, the Tamils have potential allies in other liberation groups, which have been likewise stigmatized and intimidated by the so-called anti-terror laws. The Kurdish Freedom Movement was likewise on the list of banned organizations. It has been defying the ban on its symbols as supposedly terrorist. And during that crisis in 2009, many activists in the Kurdish Freedom Movement joined the mass demonstrations of the Tamils in central London against the Sri Lankan genocide. Likewise, many Muslim groups have been targeted and stigmatized by the anti-terror laws, likewise by the PREVENT program as supposed extremists, simply because they support the Palestinian struggle against the racist settler colonial state of Israel. And likewise, many other civil society groups oppose these unjust laws, oppose their unjust use for labeling legitimate resistance as terrorist. So that is my suggestion. Let's look more broadly for all the other groups that are demanding social justice and opposing the UK's oppressive use of these unjust laws. So thank you for this opportunity.